The snow is dirty with ash and blood. A column of weary German soldiers stumbles down a ruined road, rifles discarded, hands raised high. Around them, American GIs stand guard, faces pale from frost and sleepless nights, uniforms stiff with frozen mud. The Battle of the Bulge has torn through the Ardennes, leaving villages in ruins and men hollowed by exhaustion. One German, barely 18, collapses in the slush. A U.S. sergeant hesitates, hand on his carbine. The prisoner looks up, eyes wide, expecting the end. Instead, the American lowers his weapon and pulls a small tin from his pack. He kneels, opens a can of rations, and pushes it toward the trembling captive. Steam rises from the food as silence settles between enemies. For a moment, war pauses. No speeches, no orders, just two men sharing warmth in a world gone cold. What neither side realized that morning was how extraordinary such mercy had become, and how it would echo far beyond the frozen fields of Europe. By the winter of 1944, the Second World War had reached a fevered pitch. The Allied armies had clawed their way out of the beaches of Normandy, driving across France in a summer of relentless advance. German defenses collapsed faster than many had predicted. Paris was liberated. Town after town fell under the Stars and Stripes, or the Union Jack. The Wehrmacht, once feared as the sharpest blade in Europe, was bleeding out across multiple fronts. Yet victory was far from certain. As autumn turned to winter, the Western Front hardened into a wall of mud, snow, and shattered forests. The American GIs who had survived the breakout from Normandy were now stretched thin across hundreds of miles. Their boots leaked, their rations froze, and their nerves frayed. German artillery still thundered from the dark woods of the Ardennes. Every farmhouse might conceal a sniper. Every white flag could be a trap. And then, in December, the last great German gamble began. The Ardennes Offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, erupted on December 16, 1944. Through dense fog and bitter cold, German panzers punched through the Allied line, catching American units off guard. In the early days, entire divisions were swallowed. Prisoners were taken in their thousands. The once confident GIs were suddenly reminded that their enemy was not yet broken. For the Germans, it was desperation disguised as strategy. Hitler believed that by striking through the Ardennes, he could split the Allied front, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a political settlement. His generals knew better. The Reich had neither the fuel nor the manpower to sustain it. Still, orders were orders. The offensive began with brutal precision. In towns like Malmedy, St. Vith, and Bastogne, fighting devolved into chaos. Columns were ambushed, villages flattened, civilians displaced by the tens of thousands. Snow muffled the sound of artillery but amplified the screams. American soldiers found themselves surrounded, freezing and hungry, fighting not only the enemy, but the elements themselves. Hatred burned deep on both sides. For the Americans, the Malmedy massacre, where over 80 unarmed U.S. prisoners were executed by SS troops, spread like wildfire. Word traveled through the ranks. Take no SS alive. Revenge became a whispered undercurrent among exhausted men. The line between soldier and avenger blurred in the snow. By Christmas, however, the tide had begun to turn. Patton's Third Army smashed through the German lines from the south, relieving the besieged at Bastogne. The Luftwaffe, crippled and outnumbered, could do little to stem the Allied advance. The offensive that had begun with such fury now unraveled under the weight of Allied firepower and logistics. Yet amid the collapsing German front, something unexpected emerged. A quiet moral test for the victors. Thousands of German soldiers began surrendering, Some were veterans of years of brutal campaigns in Russia. Others were boys pulled from school and thrown into uniform. Their faces were pale, uniforms tattered, boots worn through. Many expected no mercy. Propaganda had told them that capture by the Allies meant death, humiliation, or starvation, and many American soldiers, hardened by months of death and comrades lost, could have justified their hatred. They had seen the camps. They had walked through villages razed by retreating German troops. The thought of compassion toward the enemy seemed almost unnatural. But war has a way of revealing the core of human nature, sometimes not in grand speeches or victories, but in the smallest, quietest gestures. As the German army crumbled, American troops found themselves surrounded by prisoners who looked more like lost children than monsters. The line between foe and fellow man began to blur in the snow. The winter of 1944 was a crucible. It stripped away ideology, leaving only hunger, exhaustion, and survival. And it was in that bleak landscape that acts of mercy, rare and fragile, began to flicker, defying the expectations of both sides. These moments would become the unseen side of victory, proof that even in total war, humanity could still endure. For those who fought through the winter of 1944, the word enemy had begun to lose its certainty. The German soldiers surrendering in the Ardennes were not the triumphant warriors of 1940. They were thin, shivering remnants of a dying army, men fighting for survival more than ideology. Many hadn't eaten properly in days. Others had marched barefoot through ice and shell fire. Their faces carried the look of a people who already knew they had lost. Yet, the Allied soldiers confronting them had been taught something very different. Back home, U.S. training manuals and propaganda reels painted the enemy as cruel, relentless, even subhuman. Posters warned of German deception. Soldiers were told to keep their guard up, to trust no surrender, to remember their fallen comrades. The war in Europe, though less savage than in the Pacific, was still a crucible of fear and retribution. Every captured town revealed evidence of forced labor, executions, or civilian massacres. Compassion seemed like weakness, but the rules of war had changed long before the Ardennes. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established clear guidelines for the treatment of prisoners of war, a fragile thread of humanity in an otherwise inhuman conflict. The United States, Britain, and Germany were all signatories, though adherence varied wildly depending on circumstance. In the East, on the vast killing fields between Germany and the Soviet Union, the conventions meant nothing. There, surrender often led to execution or starvation. On the Western Front, however, the laws still held, at least on paper. American High Command took those rules seriously. Orders from General Eisenhower's headquarters emphasized that the humane treatment of prisoners reflects the honor of our forces and the ideals for which we fight. Still, such directives were tested daily on the frozen front lines. War had eroded restraint. After months of watching friends die, mercy became a complicated thing. In the chaos of late 1944, the sheer number of German captives overwhelmed the Allied system. Thousands surrendered in waves, columns stretching miles through snow and mud. U.S. MPs struggled to process them all. Makeshift enclosures were formed out of wire, barns, or open fields. Supplies were limited, rations short, and medics overstretched. Yet, despite the shortages, a surprising pattern emerged in the reports, sent back from the front. American soldiers, on their own initiative, sharing rations with the enemy. It was rarely dramatic. Often, it happened quietly. A corporal handing a cigarette across a fence line, a medic bandaging a wounded German before tending to his own. These gestures rarely made headlines or reports, but they lingered in memory. To the German prisoners, raised under years of Nazi propaganda depicting Americans as ruthless and degenerate, such kindness was almost incomprehensible. Captured soldiers later spoke of their confusion. They had been told that Allied troops would torture or kill them on sight. Instead, they were fed. Some were even allowed to keep personal items. For many, it was their first direct experience of life outside the regime's control. And it planted seeds of doubt, even shame. As one former Wehrmacht private recalled, years later, "It was the first time I realized the enemy might be more human than the leaders who sent us to die." Still, this behavior was not universal. There were also moments of bitterness and cruelty, especially when units stumbled upon evidence of German atrocities. Burned towns, executed civilians, mutilated bodies of American prisoners. In those moments, restraint broke. The war remained capable of brutality until its final day. Yet it was precisely because of that darkness that the glimpses of mercy stood out so sharply. Behind the lines, the Allied command faced a logistical and moral challenge: how to treat millions of prisoners humanely without crippling their own supply chains. POW camps sprang up across France, Belgium, and later within the United States itself. Each became a microcosm of post-war transformation. Enemies housed, fed, and sometimes educated by their conquerors. But that larger story began here in the Ardennes, with frostbitten soldiers realizing that the line between enemy and human being could melt in the snow. As the last German pockets were crushed and the Western Front moved toward the Rhine, thousands of these prisoners carried with them a single enduring image: an American soldier, weary and hungry, breaking open a can of rations and sharing it without a word. That image, quietly passed from one prisoner to another, would travel farther than any propaganda broadcast. And soon, it would become the foundation of something deeper: the unexpected compassion that defined the American treatment of German POWs across Europe and beyond. War, at its heart, is a collision of human extremes: hatred and mercy, destruction and empathy. By late 1944, that contrast was never sharper. For the American soldiers trudging through Belgium's forests and bombed-out villages, every day blurred into cold exhaustion. Yet somewhere between the instinct to survive and the duty to fight, humanity kept resurfacing. For most GIs, the German soldier was not an abstract villain. He was the man on the other side of the hedgerow, the one who shouted, "Nicht schießen!" when his ammunition ran dry. He was an enemy, but also a mirror. Many young Americans looked across the line and saw someone just as scared, just as far from home. Most of these men had never imagined themselves capable of killing. They were farmers, mechanics, clerks, civilians dressed in olive drab. When they faced captured Germans, frostbitten, trembling, pleading, a quiet recognition passed between them. Both had been shaped by forces far larger than themselves. Private diaries from the 99th Infantry Division reveal moments of unexpected empathy. One entry from January 1945 read simply, "Fed a kraut today. He looked no older than my brother. God forgive us all." Another GI, part of the 106th Division, wrote home after the Bulge. "They told us never to trust them, but when you see them up close, just boys in torn boots, you stop seeing Nazis. You just see hunger." These were not grand gestures of forgiveness. They were human instincts surfacing in the middle of horror. And perhaps that was what made them so powerful. In an environment engineered for dehumanization, the smallest act of decency became an act of quiet rebellion. For German prisoners, capture by the Americans was a moment of dread, often worse than the thought of dying. The Nazi regime had spent years cultivating fear of Allied cruelty. Soldiers were told that surrender meant mutilation or execution. Rumors spread that Americans shot captives or left them to starve. To surrender was not only dishonor, it was a death sentence in disguise, and so, when the first encounters proved otherwise, disbelief set in. Accounts from German POWs describe those first hours vividly. They were herded together, stripped of weapons, searched for hidden pistols. They expected beatings, mockery, even revenge. Instead, American guards offered cigarettes. Sometimes a corporal tossed chocolate bars into the group. To starving men, it felt unreal, a trap, perhaps. But when no blow came, when the guards simply walked away, something inside them shifted. A former member of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division recalled decades later, "They did not look at us with hatred. They looked tired." One of them shared coffee from his canteen. "It was the first warm thing I had tasted in 3 days. I began to wonder if everything we had been told about them was a lie." For the American troops, these gestures carried a different kind of power. They were a way of asserting control, not through violence, but through restraint. To treat the enemy with dignity was to prove that the war had not consumed one's soul. Many soldiers later spoke of it as a point of pride. They had done their duty without becoming the thing they fought. Yet there was also a deeper, unspoken motive. Compassion could be a survival mechanism of its own. Psychologists later studying wartime behavior found that moments of empathy, even brief ones, helped soldiers cope with trauma. To show mercy was to remind oneself that the world still had meaning. For some, it was the only way to stay human in a landscape that demanded otherwise. As winter dragged into early 1945, these encounters multiplied. In ruined barns, at roadside collection points, in fields littered with burnt vehicles, scenes repeated themselves across the front. A GI tearing his K-ration in half, a medic tending to a wounded German, a guard allowing a prisoner to keep a photograph of his family. Each act was small, fleeting, often unnoticed by command. But to the men who experienced them, they cut through months of hatred and propaganda like a shaft of light through smoke. And for many Germans, that single moment, a taste of food, a gesture of respect, would become their first step toward understanding the true cost of the war they had fought. Years later, when historians interviewed former POWs, they often returned to the same words: "We could not believe it." In the silence that followed the Battle of the Bulge, the roads of Belgium and Luxembourg were filled with columns of surrendering soldiers, gray uniforms blending into the snow. On both sides, the fighting spirit had burned itself out. All that remained were men, cold, hungry, and profoundly weary. For some Americans, sharing food with a defeated enemy was not an act of kindness, but of closure. As one sergeant put it in his post-war journal, "We had won. There was no need for hate anymore." But for others, it went deeper than victory. It was a statement about who they were, a quiet refusal to let the war define them entirely. War, at its heart, is a collision of human extremes, hatred and mercy, destruction and empathy. By late 1944, that contrast was never sharper. For the American soldiers trudging through Belgium's forests and bombed-out villages, every day blurred into cold exhaustion. Yet somewhere between the instinct to survive and the duty to fight, humanity kept resurfacing. For most GIs, the German soldier was not an abstract villain. He was the man on the other side of the hedgerow, the one who shouted, "Nicht schießen!" when his ammunition ran dry. He was an enemy, but also a mirror. Many young Americans looked across the line and saw someone just as scared, just as far from home. Most of these men had never imagined themselves capable of killing. They were farmers, mechanics, clerks, civilians dressed in olive drab. When they faced captured Germans, frostbitten, trembling, pleading, a quiet recognition passed between them. Both had been shaped by forces far larger than themselves. Private diaries from the 99th Infantry Division reveal moments of unexpected empathy. One entry from January 1945 read simply, "Fed a kraut today." He looked no older than my brother. God forgive us all. Another GI, part of the 106th Division, wrote home after the Bulge. They told us never to trust them, but when you see them up close, just boys in torn boots, you stop seeing Nazis, you just see hunger. These were not grand gestures of forgiveness. They were human instincts surfacing in the middle of horror. And perhaps that was what made them so powerful. In an environment engineered for dehumanization, the smallest act of decency became an act of quiet rebellion. For German prisoners, capture by the Americans was a moment of dread, often worse than the thought of dying. The Nazi regime had spent years cultivating fear of Allied cruelty. Soldiers were told that surrender meant mutilation or execution. Rumors spread that Americans shot captives or left them to starve. To surrender was not only dishonor, it was a death sentence in disguise. And so, when the first encounters proved otherwise, disbelief set in. Accounts from German POWs describe those first hours vividly. They were herded together, stripped of weapons, searched for hidden pistols. They expected beatings, mockery, even revenge. Instead, American guards offered cigarettes. Sometimes, a corporal tossed chocolate bars into the group. To starving men, it felt unreal, a trap, perhaps. But when no blow came, when the guards simply walked away, something inside them shifted. A former member of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division recalled decades later, "They did not look at us with hatred. They looked tired." One of them shared coffee from his canteen. "It was the first warm thing I had tasted in 3 days." I began to wonder if everything we had been told about them was a lie. For the American troops, these gestures carried a different kind of power. They were a way of asserting control, not through violence, but through restraint. To treat the enemy with dignity was to prove that the war had not consumed one's soul. Many soldiers later spoke of it as a point of pride. They had done their duty without becoming the thing they fought. Yet there was also a deeper, unspoken motive. Compassion could be a survival mechanism of its own. Psychologists later studying wartime behavior found that moments of empathy, even brief ones, helped soldiers cope with trauma. To show mercy was to remind oneself that the world still had meaning. For some, it was the only way to stay human in a landscape that demanded otherwise. As winter dragged into early 1945, these encounters multiplied. In ruined barns, at roadside collection points, in fields littered with burnt vehicles, scenes repeated themselves across the front. A GI tearing his K-ration in half, a medic tending to a wounded German, a guard allowing a prisoner to keep a photograph of his family. Each act was small, fleeting, often unnoticed by command. But to the men who experienced them, they cut through months of hatred and propaganda like a shaft of light through smoke. And for many Germans, that single moment, a taste of food, a gesture of respect, would become their first step toward understanding the true cost of the war they had fought. Years later, when historians interviewed former POWs, they often returned to the same words. We could not believe it. In the silence that followed the Battle of the Bulge, the roads of Belgium and Luxembourg were filled with columns of surrendering soldiers. Gray uni from these frozen fields and shattered towns, an invisible current began to spread, one that would soon reach across the Atlantic to the POW camps of America itself, reshaping not only the fate of the captured Germans, but the moral identity of the victors. By early 1945, the Western Front was collapsing, but the moral front, that invisible battlefield inside every soldier, was still being fought. The Americans had the upper hand militarily, yet the question of how to win and what kind of men they would become in victory weighed heavier with each passing day. War is often described as the failure of morality. Yet, within that failure, moments of choice still exist. choices that reveal more about nations than any victory parade. Among the snow-covered ruins of Belgium and Western Germany, American soldiers confronted those moments again and again. Do you feed a man who, hours earlier, might have tried to kill you? Do you treat his wounds when your own comrade lies bleeding nearby? Many soldiers acted not because of orders, but in defiance of what war expected. They could not bring themselves to hate a man already beaten. Others saw it as a reflection of the ideals they believed they were defending: freedom, decency, and the rule of law. Letters home capture that quiet moral awakening. One lieutenant wrote, "They taught us to destroy, but nobody said what to do once the destroying was done." Another, writing from a makeshift POW cage near Bastogne, confessed, "I kept thinking of how our boys would want to be treated if the roles were reversed." The decision to show mercy became a personal act of conviction. Small, unrecorded, but deeply symbolic. It was the opposite of vengeance. It was discipline, and discipline in war is a kind of faith, the belief that humanity can survive its own violence. This moral restraint didn't erase the rage of combat or the grief of loss, but it placed boundaries around them. It said, "We will not become what we fight." Behind those small human gestures were larger decisions made by commanders who understood that moral conduct was strategic, not sentimental. General Eisenhower's headquarters consistently reinforced the importance of adhering to the Geneva Conventions. Orders emphasized that POWs must be treated according to international law: fed, sheltered, and protected. Violations would not only stain the Allied cause, but risk retribution against captured Americans. At the company level, officers carried that burden in more immediate ways. They had to balance compassion with control, to ensure that kindness didn't invite danger or disorder. Yet many chose to lead by example. A story circulated among infantry units after the Bulge. A U.S. captain had discovered his men roughing up a captured SS trooper. Instead of shouting, he simply ordered them to stand down and handed the prisoner a cigarette. When one soldier protested, "After what they did at Malmedy?" the captain replied, "That's exactly why we can't." Moments like that shaped morale more deeply than any speech. They reminded the men that the uniform they wore represented something greater than revenge. American leadership, from field commanders to division chaplains, often tied humane conduct to identity. The difference between tyranny and democracy, between conquest and liberation. Even at the administrative level, the U.S. Army's approach to POW handling became a logistical reflection of those ideals. Special branches were established for prisoner management. Rations were calculated to meet nutritional standards. Red Cross inspections were permitted. None of this was easy. Supply shortages meant that U.S. troops sometimes ate worse than their captives. Yet orders held firm. Prisoners must be fed first if supplies ran short. That policy was more than bureaucracy. It was a statement that civilization itself depended on restraint, even at the height of war. To the German prisoners, that restraint was not only shocking, it was transformative. Many had served on the Eastern Front, where mercy was almost extinct. There, both Nazi and Soviet propaganda had erased the concept of surrender. Captivity meant starvation, torture, or death. Out of 3 million German soldiers captured by the Red Army, more than half would never return. In that context, the experience of being captured by Americans felt like stepping into another world. Former Wehrmacht infantryman Günther K., interviewed in 1953, described the contrast starkly. "In Russia, we buried our dead in the snow and envied them. In France, when I was taken by the Americans, they gave me bread and soup. I cried while eating." For the Allies, this difference became one of the war's most powerful psychological tools. Leaflets dropped over German lines urged soldiers to surrender to American or British forces, rather than die for a lost cause. The reputation for fair treatment became, in itself, a weapon. undermining German morale, far more forms blending into the snow. On both sides, the fighting spirit had burned itself out. All that remained were men, cold, hungry, and profoundly weary. For some Americans, sharing food with a defeated enemy was not an act of kindness, but of closure. As one sergeant put it in his post-war journal, "We had won. There was no need for hate anymore." The winter sun was low over the Ardennes, a pale disk behind drifting smoke. By mid-January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed. The once proud divisions that had stormed through the fog a month earlier were now in retreat, shattered, starving, and surrounded. Entire units surrendered by the hundreds, trudging through snowdrifts under white flags made from torn shirts. For the Americans, the victory came at a terrible cost. Tens of thousands were dead, wounded, or missing. Tanks sat frozen in the mud, engines seized by the cold. The ground was littered with the remnants of a battle that had consumed both sides. Rations torn open, boots half buried in ice, weapons discarded where men had fallen. In this frozen graveyard of ambition, one of the most remarkable transformations of the war began to unfold. Outside the ruined Belgian village of Foy, a small U.S. infantry unit was tasked with processing a group of captured Germans, roughly 60 men, including several from the 9th Panzer Division. The Americans were exhausted. They had been fighting for nearly 3 weeks without rest. The memory of Malmedy hung in the air like a ghost. At dawn, the prisoners were gathered in a bombed-out barn. The temperature was below freezing. Most of them had no gloves, no food, and no hope. Some could barely stand. Their commander, a gaunt officer in a frayed greatcoat, requested permission to speak. When granted, he simply said in broken English, "Please, food for the men." There was silence. The American lieutenant in charge, no older than 25, stared at the line of captives. His men waited for an order. They had lost friends in the Bulge. They had seen trucks full of American corpses. No one would have blamed them for turning away. Instead, the lieutenant reached into his pack, pulled out a tin of sea rations, and handed it to the German officer. "Share it," he said quietly. Then, one by one, the other Americans followed. Cans, biscuits, cigarettes. The Germans hesitated, unsure if it was a cruel trick. When they finally ate, several wept openly. A U.S. sergeant later wrote in his notebook, "We expected hate. What we saw was hunger. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like mercy." That small act, unplanned, unsanctioned, became a story passed from unit to unit. No one wrote official reports about it, but among the soldiers who witnessed it, it left a mark deeper than any medal could. Scenes like that repeated themselves across Belgium, Luxembourg, and Western Germany. As German lines crumbled, surrender became an avalanche. By February 1945, Allied forces were taking in tens of thousands of prisoners every day. Some were Waffen-SS, others regular Wehrmacht, Volkssturm, or teenage recruits dragged from schools. The front lines were dissolving into streams of exhausted men stumbling toward captivity. The U.S. Army, overwhelmed, established temporary enclosures, Rheinwiesenlager, open fields ringed with barbed wire. The conditions were primitive but not malicious. American commanders understood that the sheer scale of the surrender was beyond logistical planning. Still, amidst the chaos, countless small gestures of decency persisted. A Red Cross observer recorded one such moment near the town of Malmedy. An American corporal stood in the cold for hours handing soup through the wire. He spoke no German. They spoke no English. But every time he filled a cup, he smiled. One of the prisoners said later he had not seen a man smile in months. For the captured Germans, the realization came slowly, that the enemy they had been taught to despise had no interest in vengeance. Many described it as the moment they truly understood that the war was lost, not just militarily, but morally. For the Americans, These encounters became something else entirely, a reaffirmation of purpose. They had been fighting not only to defeat tyranny, but to preserve the idea that even in victory, one must remain just. The true turning point was not marked by a single battle or signature. It happened quietly, in the mind of the ordinary soldier. The same men who had entered Europe hardened by fear and propaganda were now facing an enemy stripped of power, and in that vulnerability, they rediscovered empathy. Some soldiers described feeling an almost spiritual clarity in those moments. One chaplain attached to the 3rd Armored Division wrote in his diary, "War dehumanizes both sides. But when a man shares his bread with the one who tried to kill him, he wins something far greater than the battle." This was the invisible victory, one that no map could show. It was the moment when the American army, scarred and weary, chose restraint over revenge, and in doing so, defined what it meant to be a liberator rather than a conqueror. From those snowbound villages, that spirit would follow the war into Germany itself. As Allied troops crossed the Rhine and pushed toward the heart of the Reich, the question was no longer whether they would win, but what kind of world they would build from the ashes. When the guns finally fell silent over the Ardennes, what remained was not triumph, but fatigue. The survivors, on both sides, walked through a landscape stripped bare by war. The trees were splintered, villages flattened, and the frozen air still smelled of smoke and decay. Yet within that desolation, something rare had taken root: empathy. Official U.S. after-action reports from early 1945 mention little about mercy. They spoke of processing prisoners, securing supply lines, maintaining discipline. But in the margins, in letters, diaries, and Red Cross interviews, the human story emerged. A U.S. medic with the 4th Infantry Division wrote, "We had a batch of prisoners, most wounded. I treated them just like ours. One German boy, maybe 16, cried when I wrapped his leg. Said he thought I'd kill him. I told him, 'The war's over for you, kid.' He didn't understand the words, but he understood my tone." In another account, recorded by the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Branch, a German POW in Belgium described his disbelief at capture. "They gave us coffee and bread. I had not eaten in 4 days. We waited for the beatings, but they never came. Some Americans even joked with us. We began to feel shame more than fear." These stories repeated across hundreds of miles, too often and too consistently to be coincidence. Compassion had become contagious. At one makeshift collection point near St. Vith, an American lieutenant ordered his men to gather food for a group of captured Germans. When one of his sergeants asked why, he replied simply, "Because we can." That phrase, quiet, unheroic, profoundly human, captured the essence of what was happening across the front. The power to show mercy had become its own kind of strength. For German POWs, these moments struck deeper than any Allied leaflet or speech could. They challenged everything they had been told about the enemy, and, in doing so, exposed the moral collapse of the Reich itself. A captured SS officer, interrogated near Liège, reportedly admitted, "Our people were told Americans were animals. Yet you feed our wounded, you bury our dead with crosses. How can a man fight against that?" Another prisoner, interviewed after the war, described how the act of being treated decently by an enemy felt more devastating than defeat. It broke something inside us. We had lived for years believing we were the chosen, that the world was beneath us. And then, the men we were told were savages treated us better than our own leaders ever did. These psychological fractures would ripple far beyond the battlefield. Many former German POWs later became among the first advocates for reconciliation. Some returned home with stories that contradicted Nazi propaganda so completely that even their families struggled to believe them. The American command soon recognized the unintended power of these small gestures. Leaflets began circulating along the front. promising German soldiers fair treatment and food if they surrendered. Loudspeakers broadcast the same message in German. You will live. You will eat. You will go home. It wasn't empty rhetoric. By the spring of 1945, the United States held over 3 million German prisoners across Europe and the United States. The system was strained, imperfect, but fundamentally humane. The consistent adherence to the Geneva Convention became one of the most potent moral victories of the Allied cause. Yet this moral clarity came at a cost. For every soldier who shared his rations, there was another still haunted by the faces of his dead friends. Not all could forgive, and not all did. But even among those who could not forget, many chose not to retaliate. They obeyed their orders, not out of cold discipline, but out of an understanding that vengeance would not bring their comrades back. In that sense, mercy was not weakness. It was control. It was the decision to stop the chain of cruelty at one's own hands. The war was not over yet. The Rhine still lay ahead, and beyond it, the heart of Germany. But for thousands of soldiers, something fundamental had shifted. They had seen the enemy up close, stripped of weapons and ideology. They had seen hunger in his eyes, the same hunger they themselves had known. In those frozen days, many began to realize that the real victory was not merely defeating Germany, but defeating the impulse to hate. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, veterans would recall those moments not as stories of battlefield glory, but of awakening. One infantryman from the 2nd Division wrote in 1982, "The day I gave a German my food, I stopped fighting a war and started living as a man again." For some, that transformation was fleeting. For others, lifelong. But in the broader arc of the war, it marked a quiet, moral turning point. The moment the victors proved that decency could survive even amid destruction. In the following months, that same decency would be tested again and again, in the prisoner camps, in the occupation zones, and in the rebuilding of a shattered continent. The humanity shown in the snow-covered fields of Belgium had lit a fragile flame, one that would now have to survive the machinery of post-war reality. When the fighting finally ended in May 1945, the world exhaled. But it was not a peaceful breath. Europe was a continent in ruins, its rivers choked with bridges and bodies, its cities hollow shells. For millions, survival became the new front line. And in the midst of that chaos stood an astonishing sight. Lines of German prisoners stretching for miles, surrendering not to hatred, but to a strange, almost humane captivity. The numbers were staggering. By war's end, the Allies held nearly 11 million German POWs, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Poland. The United States alone accounted for around 3.4 million spread across Europe, North Africa, and the American heartland. It was the largest mass internment of enemy soldiers in modern history. Maintaining decency on that scale was no small feat. U.S. and British forces faced severe shortages of food, shelter, and transport. The war had ended, but supply chains were still strained, and morale was thin. There were dark moments, harsh conditions, hunger, confusion. Yet even amid the logistical collapse, the guiding principle held: prisoners were to be treated as men, not monsters. The Geneva Convention of 1929 became more than a document. It became a moral line in the rubble. American commanders reminded their troops that the way they treated the defeated would define the peace that followed. In a 1945 directive to camp administrators, General Dwight D. Eisenhower wrote, "The eyes of the world are upon us. The manner in which we handle these men will influence the character of Germany's rebirth, and of our own." That philosophy shaped policy across thousands of camps. German prisoners received food roughly equivalent to Allied soldiers' rations, medical care when possible, and access to letters home. They were organized into work detachments, repairing roads, clearing debris, rebuilding farms, labor not of punishment, but of reconstruction. When large groups of POWs were transferred to the United States, another transformation began. From 1943 to 1946, over 425,000 German prisoners were held across more than 700 camps in America. From Texas to Pennsylvania, from the wheat fields of Kansas to the forests of Oregon. At first, local communities feared them. Newspapers warned of Nazi infiltration or enemy spies. But the reality turned out very different. Farmers quickly realized that the young men sent to help harvest their crops were hungry, polite, and desperate to work. Many Americans were shocked by how normal their enemies appeared, and many prisoners were equally stunned by the civility of their captors. They lived in barracks, attended classes, played soccer, and even joined orchestras. Camp libraries offered English lessons and philosophy. Some were shown films on democracy and freedom. It was a quiet experiment, part rehabilitation, part moral statement, proving that a defeated people could be confronted not with revenge, but with reason. A former German POW, Karl-Heinz Stempel, later recalled in an interview, "They treated us like human beings. For the first time in years, we could think without fear. It made us question everything we had believed." Not all POW experiences were equal. In the East, where the Soviet Union held millions of German soldiers, the treatment was drastically different, marked by forced labor, starvation, and slow death. Soviet archives later confirmed that of the 3 million Germans captured by the Red Army, more than one-third never returned. This stark contrast magnified the moral divide between the two emerging superpowers. Western Allied camps, with all their imperfections, became symbols of restraint, of civilization preserved. The decision of American soldiers months earlier, in the snows of the Ardennes, to share a meal instead of vengeance had set a tone that now echoed across the occupied continent. And as thousands of those same POWs began returning home under repatriation programs, they carried those memories with them. Stories of decency and defeat that quietly undermined the last vestiges of Nazi myth. In the next phase, the world would begin to rebuild, not just cities and bridges, but trust itself. And the former prisoners, once enemies, would play a surprising role in that fragile reconstruction. By the late summer of 1945, German prisoners were scattered across 2 continents, from small rural camps in the American Midwest to vast barbed wire enclosures in France and Belgium. Many had not yet fully understood that the war was over. For them, captivity became a second kind of front, one fought not with rifles, but with patience, dignity, and the slow rediscovery of humanity. As peace settled over Europe, a subtle transformation unfolded. For thousands of German POWs, the treatment they received from American guards became the first example of a world without Nazi control. They encountered fairness, discipline, and moral consistency. Values that contradicted everything the Reich had promised them. Some began writing letters home describing the strange civility of their captors. Censors read many of these, noting their recurring theme. They treat us as men. Such letters were more powerful than any Allied propaganda leaflet. They filtered back into a devastated Germany, reaching families who could scarcely believe that their sons and fathers, once branded as the enemy of mankind, were being shown compassion. In post-war interviews, several prisoners described that realization as transformative. One wrote, "We had been told the Allies would shoot us. Instead, they fed us. That broke the last chain of lies. These men returned home not only as survivors but as witnesses, carriers of a narrative that would help shape West Germany's moral foundation in the years to come." By 1946, as reconstruction efforts accelerated, thousands of German POWs remained in the United States. Rather than being locked away, many were put to work rebuilding the nation they had once fought against. repairing roads, logging forests, harvesting crops. In Texas and Iowa, locals began inviting small groups of POWs to Sunday dinners. In Alabama, school children sent letters to the German boys working nearby. Gradually, the fear and suspicion gave way to curiosity, even respect. These small gestures left deep impressions on both sides. Some former guards and prisoners stayed in contact for decades. A number of POWs later emigrated to the United States after the war, citing those early experiences as the reason they believed reconciliation was possible. In one documented case, a farmer in Georgia wrote a recommendation letter for a former POW who wished to return and live in America, saying simply, "He worked for me when the war was new and wounds were fresh. He showed me that good men can wear any uniform." Such relationships, personal, unrecorded, but real, became threads in the fabric of post-war understanding between the U.S. and Germany. For American soldiers, too, the experience left lasting marks. Many veterans later confessed that treating their former enemies with decency had been one of the most difficult and most defining challenges of their service. It required restraint stronger than hatred and discipline deeper than fear. In 1947, a U.S. Army chaplain reflected in a report to Washington, "Mercy in victory is a greater test of character than courage in battle." This philosophy would echo in later conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, where American military codes of conduct drew lessons directly from the POW management systems of 1945. The idea that moral behavior under pressure strengthened, rather than weakened, military power became part of modern doctrine. What began as spontaneous acts of kindness in the snow had evolved into an institutional principle. The belief that even in total war, humanity must not be lost. By 1948, the last German POWs were finally repatriated. Many returned to find their homes destroyed and their nation divided between East and West. Yet their memories of fair treatment abroad often stood in stark contrast to the devastation they found at home. Some of these men became teachers, mayors, and community leaders in the new Federal Republic of Germany. They carried with them a quiet conviction that decency, not domination, defined strength. Historians would later argue that this experience helped prepare the psychological ground for Germany's democratic rebirth. The contrast between the cruelty they had been taught and the humanity they had witnessed served as a mirror, forcing them to confront what their own nation had become and what it could be again decades later. Survivors of those encounters still recalled the small, unforgettable details: the taste of American coffee after years of hunger, the sound of laughter between barbed wire fences, the shock of being treated not as an animal, but as a man. One veteran, interviewed in 1994, said, "It wasn't just food they shared, it was the idea that mercy could win a war more completely than any weapon." That sentiment would become the quiet legacy of an entire generation. Proof that victory, at its most profound, comes not from domination, but from restraint. The guns had fallen silent, but the moral resonance of those moments endured, rippling outward into the architecture of a new Europe and into the conscience of a world still learning what it meant to be human after total war. The war had begun with fury and ended with silence, a silence heavy with ghosts and lessons. The shattered fields of Belgium, the ruined towns of Germany, the long lines of prisoners under gray skies, all bore witness to something deeper than victory. They revealed that even in the darkest of human moments, compassion could still survive. History often remembers the battles, the generals, the weapons. But history endures because of moments like these: a tired sergeant handing a can of rations to a starving enemy, a medic tending a wounded German without hesitation, a prisoner realizing that mercy had replaced vengeance. Such moments did not win the war on maps, but they won something greater: the proof that humanity could outlast hatred. In the decades that followed, the former enemies would become allies. The United States and Germany, once locked in total war, would stand together as partners, in defense, in democracy, in rebuilding the free world. That unlikely future began not in conference halls or treaties, but in the snow and mud of the Ardennes, when ordinary men chose decency over destruction. The young Germans who once surrendered in fear returned home with an idea stronger than ideology, that strength without mercy is only another form of weakness. And the Americans who shared their rations learned that the true measure of victory lies not in how fiercely one fights, but in how humanly one ends the fight. The rifles were lowered, the tins were opened, and across the frozen silence of Europe, two enemies sat for a moment as men, not conqueror and captive, not victor and vanquished, but simply human. That is how the greatest wars truly end. Not when the last shot is fired, but when the first act of mercy is remembered.